Hello, I'm Quince. Welcome to the fourth in my series of reviews for Season 1 of the Playdate, Panic's handheld gaming console. Each week, two brand new games from different developers appear like magic on your Playdate system, and Week 4's games are Flipper Lifter and Echoic Memory. So what do you make for a handheld gaming console best played in short bursts on a limited budget and schedule? Why, a quick-playing, high-score chasing arcade game, of course. And Flipper Lifter is another one of those from Serenity Forge. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's a proven formula and it really does just make sense on the Playdate. In Flipper Lifter, you control an elevator, moving it up and down to different floors by rotating the crank. At each floor are little penguins waiting to hop on board, and as soon as a penguin is loaded onto your elevator, they'll want to be taken to a different floor. You know, the thing elevators are for. And that will be indicated by a little exclamation point. Each time you make a successful drop-off at the assigned floor, you get a point. Now the trick here is that you gotta be quick. If you make a penguin wait too long to reach their destination, they'll get mad and leave the elevator wherever you are, and not only will you lose that potential point, your elevator will also get frozen in place for a few seconds, costing you more precious time. So the game becomes a balancing act of working out the most efficient path to pick up and drop off passengers. Best case scenario, you drop off penguins at a floor that has multiple penguins lined up and ready to go, but often you'll need to bounce around from floor to floor, and you have to decide as you go when it's worth it to wait for somebody to get on board, or when you just gotta keep moving. Unlike the Week 1 game Whitewater Wipeout, there is a little bit of progression in Flipper Lifter. Meeting a certain score threshold unlocks new levels, and there are 5 levels total to unlock. Each one gets a little more complicated, adds more elevators, more floors, and usually some kind of gimmick like being able to move from left to right instead of just up and down. They get harder too. It definitely took me several tries to get the scores I needed for the last couple of stages, so the game really does encourage you to learn how each one works and how to optimize your strategies there. I've seen a few people comparing Flipper Lifter to classic Game & Watch games, like the ones where you have to make cakes on a conveyor belt or deliver packages and whatnot, and that is pretty spot on. It's very much got those vibes. This is another pretty good utilization of the crank. Spinning it to move up and down feels pretty good, and it's a lot more engaging than if you were just pushing up and down on a D-pad. It's also just imprecise enough to add that extra bit of tension when you're trying really hard to pick up another penguin before time runs out. However, I don't always love that lack of precision. In some areas, I think you can see where the game maybe ran up against the limitations of having it controllable only through the crank. Namely, when moving from left to right instead of up and down, you have to stop for a second at a certain point before it will take you to the other side. Or other times, even when you're just stopping at a regular floor, it can be pretty hard to gauge when exactly you need to stop rotating, if you've fully landed on that level, or if you're still kind of halfway between two floors and you can't quite tell. And that can be frustrating when you feel like you've wasted even just a half a second because of a miscalculation like that. Maybe it would have been too easy though if they made that smoother. So it does at least encourage you to keep playing, trying to get better at that, get the hang of how to make those landings if you're patient enough for it. I'm going to compare this game to Whitewater Wipeout again, this time not in such a favorable way. Whereas in Whitewater Wipeout, I felt like I've always had room to improve, and the leaderboard seemed to be shifting frequently with people competing for high scores. Flipper Lifter doesn't feel like it gives you quite as much room to grow. Maybe I'm just missing some optimal strategies, but I feel like even a really good player is going to hit a score cap sooner or later, or at least figure out what that theoretically would be. Eventually the penguins start to overwhelm you, and there's only so much you can do, even if you're cranking and moving as efficiently as possible. So I think that does hurt the longevity of the game, but maybe better players than I will find ways to extend that replay value. I know that when I was trying to unlock those last couple of levels, I really felt like I was squeezing as many points as I possibly could out of the earlier stages in order to move on. Flipper Lifter is cute. Flipper Lifter is fun. As someone who really appreciates a sense of progression, even in my arcade-style games, I'm glad they gave me something to work toward with those additional levels, even though it doesn't really take that long to complete them. It was still a nice touch. Not all of the levels are home runs, but they do shake things up enough, and I had a good time with the game's system overall. Our next game is a musical memory game called Echoic Memory from developer Samantha Zero. Echoic. Anyway, the premise here is that you have a new job working on robots, tuning them up and getting them ready for retail release as they travel down the factory line. These robots are sort of like virtual home assistants from what I can gather, and there's a bit of a sci-fi element to the story as the robots start talking to you, and the game is also concerned with data collection, underappreciated factory workers, and other dystopian things that are now just a part of everyday life. Coming off of last week's Pick Pack Pup, which had sort of similar parallel themes, that makes me happy. I like to see another game that has a layer of social commentary on it, because not that many games are doing that. As for the gameplay of Echoic Memory, it is essentially just memory, a matching game, but the thing that you're memorizing and matching is music. Each robot has a set of different music clips, and when you start working on one of those musical clips will play. It's your job to listen to each track that the robot has and match them up to the one you just heard. After you've done that, another clip will play and so on until you've got them all sorted out. It's not quite that simple, however, as most of the clips will be distorted in some way. Maybe they're sped up, slowed down, or muffled, and that's where the crank comes in. You'll be rotating the crank forward and backward until you manage to make the clip listenable. Essentially, it's like scanning for the right frequency on the radio, or adjusting the tracking on a VHS tape, or some other outdated technological thing that I could reference that people do not do anymore. Now, depending on how musically inclined you are or how good your hearing is, you might find this to be a challenging process or a cakewalk. As the game goes on, they do make things more difficult by adding more tracks that you have to sift through and also making the tracks more subtly different. So it's not like you can just listen for that one guitar clip and find it right away. Later on, there might be 4 different guitar clips, and each one ends in just a slightly different note, so you have to really be careful with it. You're also on a timer, and you're only allowed 3 mistakes before you have to start all over again, which can be a lot once you're at a later stage. Echoic Memory is one of, if not the largest game in Playdate Season 1, because of all the music clips the game depends on. Those take up a lot of space. And I'm happy to report that the music sounds good. There's a nice variety of genres. You get a lot of techno or EDM sounding stuff, but also some rock, blues, classical. You do start to hear some of the same clips repeated after a while with slight variations here and there, but there's a lot that I liked and I enjoyed listening to it, even if each clip is only 4 or 5 seconds long. Unfortunately though, for me, that's mostly where my enjoyment of this game ended. My biggest issue with it is just how repetitive it is. Like I said, later robots have more snippets of music you gotta match to, and you do have to be more careful with it, but that's the only thing that changes. Other than that, there's no variety. The only thing you get to break up the gameplay is a little bit of dialogue with each robot in between each session, and those are cute, and there are hints at a larger, interesting story happening in the background, but I don't think it's ever fully realized. At the very beginning of the game, there's a dream sequence where your character dreams of being a DJ at a club. That's how you're introduced into this world. And that made me think that maybe that DJ stuff was gonna come into play somehow at some point, or you were gonna leave the factory and have different environments, different styles of gameplay. And after every section of the game, I kept waiting for those new elements to be introduced, but they just never were. And this is not a super short game. It's, I would say, relatively lengthy for what's been released so far on the Playdate. So you're gonna be going through a lot of these kinds of stages, and at a certain point, I felt like I was finishing it up out of obligation. And while for the most part, I thought matching the clips wasn't terribly difficult as long as you were paying attention, sometimes when you make enough mistakes on one of these lengthier stages, and you gotta start it all over again, It really, for me, made me want to put the game down for the rest of the day because it was just too tedious to go through it all again. I think Echoic Memory has an excellent foundation, but I really wish there was more to it. If either the gameplay was more varied or the story was more at the forefront, better developed, one of those two things at least would have helped me like it a lot more, but it doesn't really do either. There's also a sort of free play mode where you can set up memory sessions to your liking, which is cool if you're into that, but for me, this one was disappointing in spite of some legitimately great tunes. Weird week for me, week 4. Flipper Lifter on one hand is totally serviceable, but it doesn't leave a very long-lasting impression, and then Echoic Memory has some good stuff in it, but overstays its welcome by a lot. Let me know, though, what you think of these games in the comments. Maybe you disagree, maybe you have different feelings on one or the other, and if you'd like, you can find more of my Playdate reviews of these Season 1 games elsewhere on this channel, and of course, you can subscribe to get more updates. Thanks for watching, and I hope you're all having fun.